Hello and welcome. Today we're going to briefly cover how to effectively read the documentation for AutoHotkey version 2. To access the documentation, we're going to of course go to the official website, which is AutoHotkey.com. We're going to click on Documentation and click on AutoHotkey version 2.0. Now, what I'm going to cover with you today assumes that you have a basic understanding of some programming terms. Things like variables, functions, and parameters. If you don't know what those are, you're very new to programming or scripting. My recommendation for you is once you get here to the documentation page, is to read through the quick reference, or even more specifically, to come into the usage and syntax section and to read over the concepts and conventions page. This is going to talk about what values are, what variables are, functions, and several other things that will be useful to you. It is a lot of reading. Not everyone's going to enjoy that. You don't have to read it all at once. You can just take it one piece at a time, but it is a very useful thing to read. But let's go ahead and jump into writing our code and just kind of picking up where our first video of how to install AutoHotkey left off. So we're going to hop back into Visual Studio Code and we're going to begin creating a new file. You can either use the hotkey Control-N to open a new document, or you can go to File and do New Text File. Either one works, whatever you prefer. So to start, we're going to use that same first line we talked about in the last video, which is our requires line. Again, this just tells the AutoHotkey interpreter what version of AutoHotkey we are writing our script in. So we're going to do requires AutoHotkey version 2. And just like before, we're going to go ahead and save this file so that the extension that we installed can begin taking effect, and we can also get some color coding for syntax purposes. So File, Save, and you can give it whatever name you want. I again am just going to use something simple like script2. And of course that extension is .ahk. So what is a function? A function is something that we can call, and when we call the function, it's going to do a specific task. It's a repeatable code is essentially what we're talking about when we talk of functions. AutoHotkey has a bunch of built-in functions, and you can also define and use your own functions. For right now, we're going to talk about just some simple built-in functions. We're going to look at the run function and the message box function. So to start with, let's go back to the documentation. We're going to go ahead and search for message box, and then you can open that, which is going to bring you to this page here. So we briefly used a message box in the last video, but what is a message box? It's going to display a little text window containing one or more buttons. By default, it's going to have an OK button. There are options that you can use to change what buttons are present, and options you can use for other things. So the function we're using is message box, and this is how you would write it. You're going to write it as message box, and then it has three optional parameters: text, title, and options. Now when I say that these are optional parameters, I mean that you don't have to use them. So an example of that, we can come in here and we can type in message box, and we can save our file, and we can run that. And this is the default message box. If you don't provide any parameters, this is what you get. It has a default text, which is press OK to continue, an OK button, a close button, and if you don't provide a title, It just uses the name of the script. That's it. That's your default message box. So you don't have to use the text parameter, the title parameter, or the options parameter because they are optional. Now, how do we tell that they are optional? They are surrounded by these orange brackets in the function example. That's how we know that they are optional. If we move over here to the run function, we can see that it has one parameter that is not optional, which is target. You have to provide a target when using the run function, or it will not work. Now, you can provide a working directory, options, or an output variable ID, but you don't have to, because as we see, they are surrounded in those orange brackets. Those three parameters are optional. So let's look at MessageBox and see what these are. So our first parameter is text. So we can go down to the parameters section and we can look at text. What this section here is going to tell us, this is going to tell us what the text parameter is for and kind of how to use it. Now, MessageBox is a simple function, so not a whole lot that we need to learn to use it. But the number one thing we want to look at here is the parameter type, which is a string. Now, again, if you don't know what strings are or what other types are, those are covered in other areas of the documentation, such as the concepts and conventions page. But remembering to look at a parameters type will save you a big headache as you're learning the language. It's going to remove a lot of the guessing game when you get into your editor and you're writing your code. So, as we discussed previously, a string is something that is wrapped in quotation marks. So let's go ahead and use this optional parameter of text. So we're going to jump back here, and we're going to put in our quotation marks, and we're going to write hello everyone. We're going to save that and run it. And we see now here that we get, instead of the default message we had before, we get the message we have chosen to use. Now, there are two other parameters available for MessageBox. There are title and options. Now, because these are optional, we can use all of them, one of them, three of them. We can skip around which ones we want to use. All of that is up to you. So to get to the second parameter, we're going to put in a comma, and we can see with the extension here, we're now on the title parameter. It is also value type string. So we're going to go back in here, and we're going to write a new string, and we're just going to call it pop-up message. We're going to save our script, and when we run it again, we now see that it no longer has the name of our file, but it instead has that custom title that we've provided it. We'll click OK to close it, and we can actually, as I mentioned, we can erase the first parameter, but we still have to have this comma in here. This is how the back end of the programming language, the interpreter, how it knows that what we're writing is for that second piece of information, that second parameter. So we can save this, and now if we run it, we still have our custom title, but we're back to having the default message because we didn't supply a custom message. Now, if we switch to using the run command, let's go look at what run does. So run runs an external program. It opens up something on your computer. So we're going to go back in here and we're going to use run. If we try and do this without that required parameter, we can see that it gets underlined, the title of the file gets marked in red. We have a problem listed. We can go and see what that problem is. And it's expecting a parameter because the run command, again, it has a required parameter. We have to provide a target. If we don't, it will not work. Even with the problem, we can save the file, we can try and run it, but we're going to get an error. So we get an error down here. This is processed through that extension we installed, so too few parameters pass to the function. So let's go ahead and provide a parameter. We're going to jump back to the documentation. We're going to look at that first parameter, which is target. We're going to look at its string, and we're also going to see what it needs. So it needs a document, URL, executable file, something like that to launch, and it's specifically looking for the path to that file. So this is where the file can be found on our computers. So let's just do msedge.exe. We're going to save this, and then we're going to hit run. And we can see here that it launches Microsoft Edge for us in a new window. We can also change it to something more specific, like we can do just the folder path to my desktop. So C, users, development, desktop. And now when we run it, we get a folder opening up to our desktop. And that's what the run command does, but more specifically, we can see what that required parameter is. Now, of course, run has some optional parameters. We're not going to get into those right now, but what matters is that knowing the difference between a required parameter and an optional parameter. The next thing that we want to look at when reading the documentation is a return value. So sometimes functions will give you a value back, which can be used in other parts of our script. We'll go back to MessageBox to give an example of that. So for MessageBox, when we look at the return value, it's going to return a string, and that string represents which button the user pressed. So if we have just a standard message box and we want to store that in a variable called result, and then we're going to do a second message box just for fun where we display result as our custom text. We're going to go ahead and give it a title as well, button clicked. Let's go ahead and give it an option. So let's jump back to the documentation and look at some of these options. So we can see that if we use a number as our option, we can actually change which buttons are available on the message box. We're just going to do something simple, yes and no, instead of the default OK. And we can see that that number is 4. Now let's look at our type. Parameter options is still type string. So we got to remember to put it in quotes. So we're going to do that. We're going to do the number 4. Sorry, we actually want this parameter to be on the previous message box, so we get a couple options on that first one. Sorry. So we'll save it and run it. We're going to go ahead and click the yes button this first time. And on that second message box, so when we click yes, the return value is the name or the text on the button that we clicked. So that gets stored inside of result. Then on our second message box, we are displaying that result as our custom text, and then we have just a simple title for that message box. But we can see here where that return value was yes. Now if we run it again, we get that the return value is no. And that's how return values will work in when you're reading through the documentation. The last thing that is important to note is a section called remarks. So the remarks section is just going to give you some general information about the function. So when we come down to the remarks for message box, we just kind of get, this is what it usually looks like, right? It's got a custom title, custom text, and a couple buttons. We get some examples of how to see or how to design a message box, get results, things like that. And it also just has some other helpful information about the function. You may not always need to read the remarks, but there are instances where you're going to find pieces of information that will help you effectively use that function in your script. I think for this video it's ran pretty long, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it off, but I think that is a good point for us today. So we've covered when reading documentation pages, how to determine what is an optional parameter, what is a required parameter, where to find the information about those parameters, so what it's looking for, the type of information it's looking for, how to get a return value, and also where to see those remarks. I hope that this video helps you, and I hope you guys have a great day.